from my perspective, technology and interoperability is really only half the equation. You've got to spend a lot of time really thinking about organizational integration and integration of workflow. And what I really recommend is not only to plot out some of your business plan aspects, like Kathy said, but to plot out your current workflows, current, i.e. pre-pandemic really, versus your telemedicine workflows, because it's not the same. You are going to have to make some changes. And when you plot things out in advance, you're going to see what those changes are going to be. And it's not just who's interacting with the patient, the provider. You're going to see that there's other needed personnel, perhaps. You're going to find out what the time requirements are. You'll kind of see what all those different steps are. So plotting things out, and I'll show you an example in a minute. And again, from my perspective, it's a lot more about human factors, and not just the study of human factors, but literally the human beings involved in this telemedicine ecosystem that have to integrate with the technology. And then you really have to concentrate on that for efficacious, efficient, and sage as well, but safe use of telemedicine. And I think you really have to start to think about provider safety as well. And this really is some of the information that we've learned through the pandemic, is that, there's huge increase for potential of fatigue and related injuries, carpal tunnel syndrome. There's a lot, neck orders, back disorders. When you shift from in-person to digital, there's a lot of things that people just simply aren't aware of. Now, my background is radiology, and we've been doing this for some 30 years. And we've learned a lot about technology fatigue. And increasingly, if you go to the literature, people are talking about Zoom fatigue, technology fatigue, and so on. And I think it's critically important to be aware of that from the user perspective of the providers, so they don't get burnt out as well. So some of the challenges and barriers that I'm sure some of you have faced, this is just some of them, with relation to sort of integration, has been, interoperability, your security and data integration. What happens when the pandemic ends, the waivers are lifted, and all of a sudden you need a HIPAA compliant system? How do you integrate with your EMR? Phil mentioned at the beginning, how many of you are moving to Epic? Well, we're in the process right now of moving from Cerner to Epic. We're changing our PAC system, our dictation system, and all this, and it's crazy. And you really have to work at the integration and then learning and how to deal with all these different devices. And when I say devices in telemedicine, that's critical, because we have a ton of devices that are available, not necessarily all appropriate and usable for every patient, but you have to learn about these devices and devices that patients are going to bring in as well to get you information. And there's all sorts of platforms. You're going to have to deal with technology and telecom expenses. Luckily, there have been some grant programs during COVID. The FCC had some, HRSA, and so on. But once we get out of COVID, you have to figure out a sustainability plan, and how are you going to support the technology and telecom in the future? Technical skills, training, and competencies. Before COVID, like Kathy said, it was kind of moving along, but not all providers were on board. And when we got to the pandemic and people started to adapt, a lot of people were suddenly scrambling, like, how do I do this? Where do I get my training? And I'm going to talk about competencies later, but there's actually a huge national effort towards preparing our next generation. And I put in parentheses there, providers and patients, because I think we have to really educate them as well. And I'll talk about that later too. We also have to figure out provider and patient preferences. And I think that's critical. Not everybody is suitable for telemedicine. And I mean that from just the condition of the patient, the things that have to be done, whether you need labs, x-rays, and so on, but also just some people prefer to see their providers in providers in person. It's a day out. For many people, it's a hassle. You have to go to work, drop the kids off, all this other stuff. But for some people, it is a means of socialization. And we may have to think about other aspects other than just pure healthcare as to why someone may be better for telemedicine versus in person. We're also seeing huge competition with retail health, direct to consumer, urgent care clinics coming into the process and creating issues where there's not continuity of care. So you may have a patient that goes to one of these online telemedicine services and something gets prescribed that never gets to your record, and you don't know that the patient's on it because they don't feel they have to report it to you because, oh, well, that was my telemedicine thing, and there's a disconnect.